ఓకే. ఓకే. కనిపిస్తే స్టార్ట్ చేసేసారు క్లాస్. ఓకే. థ్యాంక్ యూ. Okay, I finally seem to be online. Hello again, and I'll continue with histology. We'll Today is Wednesday. Tomorrow for Mahashivratri, you have a holiday from classes. Friday again, we will have an anatomy upper limb class. So we looked at epithelium and we looked at the glands, which all the glands, exocrine and endocrine, which are essentially offshoots or features, or you can't call them modifications because the epithelium is the same. When it is in the lining of a gland, it is still either simple cuboidal or simple columnar most often, with interspersed some special cells, all of which are modified for the purpose of secreting something, which is one of the functional characteristics for which the structure will modify itself. So whenever the primary function is secretion, then the surface indentation develops to increase the surface area and to provide a pocket-like or a tube-like structure into which the gland will secrete. Actually, each cell will secrete only its products and throw it out of the surface, the luminal surface, and all of that will accumulate in this pocket or tube-like or balloon-like, cup-like area, and then as more and more volume accumulates, it flows out of the duct system and onto the surface or into the area where that secretory product has to have its action. So we looked at all that next week. Now let's jump into the second main type of histological tissue. The classification we had done is the second one is connective tissue. So the first was epithelium. We looked at all its subtypes, and we looked at what its functional characteristics were, and we looked at glands as one of the things which are epithelial in nature but which do specifically and dominantly secretory function. Today we look at the second main subtype of connective tissue. Okay. One of the characteristics of connective tissue, the most obvious, is that it is very abundant. It is there all over the place. It's there in each and every domain, every organ, every system. It's plentifully available. It has few cells. In epithelium, the cells were very rich. If you looked at a bit of epithelium, there'd be more cells and a little bit of anything else. Whereas here, the cells will be few and there'll be extracellular material, non-living in between the cells material, which is called matrix. It's diverse. The kinds of materials and the kinds of texture, the kinds of design of laying it down is very diverse. Epithelium has only a singular maximum one or two possibilities of design. But in connective tissue, many possibilities exist, which is very necessary when it comes to its function. It performs a variety of important functions. These include enclosing either areas or a bunch of cells and therefore separating that bunch of cells from other things. So wrapping together a bunch of structurally or functionally related cells, cellular materials, is the job of connective tissue. Therefore, it defines that tissue shape, its space, its interactions with other things. So connective tissue in that sense is a separating barrier, but also a defining, protect, not can't say protecting, but defining a domain which separates other things which are doing different functions. So the enclosing and the separating is done in the form of sheets which are called capsules. So these are not epithelial cellular sheets, these are connective tissue non-cellular capsules, which we will see. Mostly they are fibrous in nature, we will see. The name itself is connective tissue, and they connect A to B. So especially when they are modified in the form of tendons and ligaments, the connective tissue is organized much, we already said it's a bit diverse and a bit a lot more variable, but in some areas it's not at all variable. It is very strictly laid down in a very tight design in the form of extruded long molecular fibers in only one direction, with only one density, with only singular similar characteristics. So they band together and form strong connections between one thing and another thing. So this, when it happens in the musculoskeletal system, these structures are called tendons and ligaments. When we did classification of that system, we didn't pay much attention to tendons and ligaments. Just to differentiate these two things, because it's important for you once you come for dissection to differentiate. We already know that bone is bone, and we will look at that as a tissue later. We already know that muscle is muscle, contractile in nature, and that also we will look at histologically later. Then we looked at joints as the gaps between bones where movement can take place, mostly, but there are some immovable joints also. And we mentioned, but just today we'll differentiate that tendons are the things which connect muscles to the bone on which it acts. So the muscle is a contractile part, very different tissue, and its tendon, any muscle, you name any muscle, which are the muscles you know, all of you who go to the gym, you know your deltoid, you know your biceps. So let's say the deltoid tendon is a fibrous connective tissue element, not a muscle element, not a bone element, and it is a connecting part between the muscle and the bone to which it attaches. Whereas a ligament is usually a strap-like or cord-like or a rope-like structure directly from bone to bone, usually across a joint. So it is not a contractile element at all, like a muscle. It's a very non-contractile fixed element, which is why it is a force which binds. Muscle is a force which moves. So a ligament will be a connective tissue, dense collection, very well defined, very strictly structured to bind one bone to another across a movable joint, so that it keeps the bones together and prevents them from falling apart, especially when great loads are being carried because of the muscular contraction. So a lot of KGF is being pulled. You need ligaments to make sure that the bones are not falling apart under the stress of that powerful movement. So ligaments are very important in holding things together. They will have tensile strength as their primary property. They might also have some elasticity to allow certain kinds of movements to happen fluidly and to be able to change their position and their shape when required to, not their position, their attachments are fixed, but their shape to some extent to allow for pliability of movements. So biomechanics is a fascinating thing. The differentiator you need to remember is a tendon connects a muscle to a bone, a ligament connects a bone to a bone, or some other musculoskeletal structure to some other musculoskeletal structure, but it is non-contractile in nature. It just transmits the force, right? It doesn't generate the force. Connective tissue modified into a completely singular, separate, different tissue is bone tissue. So bone tissue is a subset of organized connective tissue. Another subset organized for a completely different purpose of storing energy is fat or adipose tissue, which also does cushioning and thermal insulation. Another tissue born of connective tissue, which means a subset, a modification, and a specialization of generic connective tissue, has become a bunch of things together which we call blood, which essentially consists of a whole lot of cells, blood cells, and a liquid matrix, a flowing liquid matrix, which is plasma. That's another fascinating different tissue we have, but it's become like that because its main function was transport. Protection. We said first line of defense was your integumentary system. Your skin is protecting you and separating you, self from non-self, defining you against everything else, right? Everyone else and everything else. The second line of defense, we said, is your immunity, which is largely provided by the white blood cell system, all of which are derived from the connective tissue base. And in that white blood system, there are granulocytes and there are lymphocytes, and we talked a little bit about the immune system, but the protecting cells of the immune system are one of the modifications or specializations of connective tissue. So these are all the functions of this very diverse, very large amount of tissue available in your body. The cells which are there, we already said, compared to the bulk volume of the tissue, the number of cells is less, right? And other elements, intercellular elements, are more. But the cells are again of a very wide variety. They are specialized cells which have to produce that matrix. Whatever is in between the cells is some stuff, some molecular stuff, and some fibrous. We already mentioned there will be lots of fibers. So who will produce this material? Some living thing only has to produce it. So the cells which produce that extracellular matrix are blasts, X-blast, osteoblast, chondroblast, right? You can say adipoblast, though I've not seen it, erythroblast, right? Cytes, the ones which are seen commonly within the matrix. They've already finished producing the matrix, they're hanging around there and maintaining the matrix. Class, which break the matrix down for remodeling. So the specialized cells of any line, of any cell line, will continue to make only that specialized kind of matrix, and they will be named as per the specialization. So osteo would be all to do with bone, chondro would be all to do with cartilage, and so on and so forth. Then I already mentioned that one specialization is fat cells or adipocytes. Mast cells, which also belong to the WBC series or the immune system series, which produce and secrete heparin and histamine. White blood cells, we already said, lymphocytes and granulocytes, also monocytes and basophils. Macrophages are one type of white blood cells which are larger and which have the capacity to phagocytose and kill and digest foreign cells or foreign proteins, therefore they provide protection. Stem cells, they are the one step before the blasts. They are sitting there, they can become anything depending on the need, depending on what is being lost, depending on what more is required. So stem cells are like a waiting master cell which can immediately rise to the occasion and deliver whichever kind of cell is required in large numbers by doing rapid mitosis. Extracellular matrix is whatever is created by these cells and which is now available in between these cells. Now you must remember this is a dead, non-living material. It just will be produced. Once it's produced, it will just sit there. It doesn't have any volition, any possibility of doing anything by itself. So what matrix is required in this area is something the cell has to decide and respond to intercellular signals and information coming in from the local terrain as well as perhaps from long distance, from hormonal messages or from neural impulses or coming via the blood in the form of some molecular concentrations in response to a rise in sugar. This will happen. In response to a rise in potassium, that will happen. So extracellular matrix is one continuous dynamics flux of material always being added to and removed, right? The blasts are creating the matrix, the clasts are removing the matrix, and that in that in-between life, the matrix is continually capable of changing. The components of it are protein fibers, of which collagen, which is the most common protein in the body, reticulin, which is forming reticular fibers which fill the spaces, and elastin, which I had mentioned before, which has this unique property of it's a molecule, it's an extracellular extruded molecule, complex molecular protein, which can stretch, that means increase its length, and then it can recoil back to its original length and shape. Apart from the fibers, which are extruded, mostly proteins, there is a ground substance which is an amorphous material, usually a sol gel kind of situation. It could be thicker in a more gel form, or it could be more water content, in which case we call it a sol form. And this ground substance largely gives a shapeless background in which all the cells and fibers are available. Then fluid, obviously there is an aqueous base, 75% of your body is water. So more than 75% of connective tissue is water, even though some of it is very solid material like bone, right? Still there's a lot of fluid in the background, which is forming a very major component of your extracellular matrix. Now, just to summarize all the categories which I mentioned before, even before all your connective tissue categories have been created to fill up and build up the bulk of your body, right in the beginning when it was being decided who will go where and do what, it was all called embryonic connective tissue. Another word for that is mesenchyme. Then when that differentiates and matures, it becomes adult connective tissue. We only further divide adult connective tissue depending on the way that material looks and performs wherever it is. So there is loose and there is dense, and connective tissue with special properties. Loose means the cells, the matrix and the fibers are dispersed far away from each other. There are lots of gaps. You'll see that when you see it under the microscope. You'll see the fibers are, they've been teased apart. They're empty looking spaces between the fibers. The matrix in between has got a uniform, homogeneous, pale colored situation. Cells you'll have to search for and see where, because there'll be a few blasts and a few sites floating around here and there. So loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, the main difference is the amount of fibers is much less in loose connective tissue, and the amount of cells is anyway less, and the amount of space is more. Whereas dense connective tissue, you'll see that the fibers, particularly collagen, is laid down in close, tight bundles, right? Like pink lines, which are close, parallelly packed. So they form like rods or sheets of fibers going in different directions. We'll see that under the microscope. Connective tissue with special properties is there in a few places. We'll try to show you some slides and we'll describe it as when you see it. The fourth type of connective tissue is cartilage. Then there is bone. Then there is blood. All of these are, once the connective tissue at mesenchyme level has decided to become cartilage, it will differentiate into what we recognize as a chondroblast, and then from then onwards it can do nothing else except specialize and form cartilage matrix, cartilage fibers, and remain behind as cartilage cells, chondrocytes. Okay, and they have very specific design of laying themselves down because they do a very specific job. They sacrifice a few properties to be able to take on other properties. They're easily recognizable because of that particular geometric orientation which they take up, and their tissue characteristics, the way they lay down, the properties which they retain will be the basis of their health. So if those properties are being disturbed, that will be the basis of the disease, which we will be able to see under the microscope again in pathology. Same thing for bone, same thing for blood. We will study those in as specialized categories of connective tissue. So coming back to the first one, that is loose connective tissue. One of the places where we see it is in this underlying layer. In skin, we already talked about, in integumentary system, we said there's a skin organ which has an epidermis and we have a dermis. So it's a epithelial domain and a connective tissue domain, tightly connected together, separated by the basement membrane of that stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. So this whole connective tissue domain is called the dermis. In that, the one which is closer to the underlying muscle is a loose connective tissue domain. If you take a piece of it and stain it and look at it under the microscope, you'll see bundles of fibers, but they are separated and distanced by these gap looking places. So you can make out that they are bundles of fibers. Some of them are more dark stained, very parallelly placed, thick fibers. Some of them are thinner and they may be looking a little more wavy. They may be looking a little more curly. And if you follow them, they actually, the thinner ones, some of them may show a branching pattern. In a area like this, you can't make out which one is a branch and which one is not. But don't worry. What you're seeing is that in this particular slide, which is at 400x magnification, we are seeing some darker blackish lines, and that has been labeled as an elastic fiber. So what they did is use a differentiating stain only for elastin, which means collagen and reticulin won't take up the stain, they will be pink. The nuclei of the cells of connective tissue will be purple. So you have fibers which are pink and you have nuclei in between which are purple. You don't see the cytoplasm and organelles and all that, you just see the nucleus. So you know that that is a fibroblast or a fibrocyte which has secreted the fiber and is sitting there, it's just waiting there. It's just available in between the tissue. The light white areas, all that liquidy domain, actually it's all very liquid domain, in which some proteinaceous substance is also available. All of that together is the amorphous intercellular matrix. And one type of fiber has been highlighted by giving it a differential stain, and that is an elastic fiber. Why we did that is to show you that elastin fibers are thin, more or less straight. They branch, some of them. Don't know if you can make out. See, this black fiber is giving a branch, which is unique because collagen and reticulin don't branch. So collagen particularly is, if you tease apart a collagen fiber bundle, how much ever you tease it, you'll still get singular molecules, long extruded molecules. They don't branch, is one of the differences. And collagen always tends, all fibers tend to be together in bundles. Elastin not so much. And elastin, as you can see, is laid down in so many different directions. And if you trace the edges of an elastin fiber, can you see it's a little wavy, curly? If you see the cut edge, it will be a little curl. The molecule will end in a kind of a curl that demonstrates its recoil property, which is different. So we will look at loose or areolar. Areolar here means full of air spaces, because the first people who saw it, they thought that in between gap is airy. It gives a sense of there being air pockets. Not at all, right? Inside your body, air is only available in the lungs, and some air in your swallowed air up to your stomach, not beyond that. All right. So everywhere else, what looks like empty pockets is not, but still the original name given was areola. You remember it as loose connective tissue. Loose packing material. Most organs and tissues have it. It is the one which is attaching the skin, dermis plus epidermis, to the underlying muscle. So the dermis is not loose. The dermis is dense, but the area beneath it, so that you can say the subcutaneous area or the hypodermis, is the loose connective tissue. Remember I said hypodermic syringe, because we used to give subcutaneous injections into this loose areolar connective tissue space, because once you release the medicine into that space, there's enough space for it to spread without causing any pain, because it's not going to stretch or make tense anything else. It's not taking up the space of something else, because already some amount of space is available, and it's got good number of blood vessels, so it gets absorbed quickly into your system. So that earlier, historically, we used to give medications into this hypodermis layer, which is the example of loose connective tissue. The fibers available are called collagen, reticular, elastin, and lots of cells are there. Dense connective tissue is regularly organized or arranged as abundant collagen fibers. So one example, like I already mentioned, is a tendon which connects muscles to bones. Another example is ligament which connects bones to bones. So we saw example of loose areolar connective tissue. Then we said dense regular connective tissue. Examples are tendons and ligaments. Dense regular elastic tissue. One example is your vocal cords, because it's a very elastic cord, which has to keep coming back to its original shape. Dense irregular tissue is where these proteins are not in any one particular direction. The geometry is not regular. When we say dense regular, we mean that the geometry of the extracellular fibers is very organized. When we say irregular, this the dermis we saw in the skin is an area of dense connective tissue, not loose. But it is not regular like tendon and ligament. It is irregular. All the fibers are in all the directions, but densely packed. Here, when the fibers are densely packed, but not in any one particular direction, that is what happens if it's not been laid down properly for whatever reason. And that's one of the reasons scars happen, is because the healing has not happened properly. It's not a surgical cut maybe, and therefore the healing is happening, or the whatever cells are coming in to repair that area are laying down fibers in all kinds of directions, and therefore you end up having an irregular but densely packed connective tissue. Dense irregular collagenous is seen in the skin dermis. Dense irregular elastic is seen in the walls of the elastic arteries. When we will show you vessels, right, arterial vessels, venous vessels and capillaries, we will see that there are two types of arteries, muscular and elastic. So when we see muscular arteries, there is muscle, smooth muscle in the tunica media, which is very contractile, which allows the blood to pulse in the arteries. The elastic arteries are the ones which are receiving blood at high pressure directly out of the heart chambers, and such as the aorta. And these elastic arteries also have a muscle domain, but in that domain there's a lot of elastin fibers. So there's a lot of smooth muscle, which is a different tissue, and a lot of elastin fibers, which is a completely different tissue. They look almost exactly the same color, same stain. It's difficult to make out from each other. But in that area, the arrangement is dense but irregular in all kinds of directions. So basically the two criteria or parameters by which we are classifying is regularity of arrangement of the fibers and whether it's densely packed or loosely packed. Then further you can divide into which fibers are we talking about. So if it's all elastic fibers, then it is dense regular elastic. If it is all collagenous fibers, then if it's irregular, it is dermis. If it's elastic fibers but irregularly placed, they are seen in the walls of arteries. Try not to get confused. Just understand that we made an attempt to classify with examples just to help you understand that the body lays down connective tissue as per the requirement of that particular organ, and dominantly some organs have certain functions only. So then they need fibers in a particular direction only, or they need fibers to be in all directions so that they can respond to whatever will happen next. In which case irregularity is a good thing, because already fibers are laid in several directions. That will serve a different purpose. If they are not transmitting force, then regularity is not required, and so on and so forth. So dense regular connective tissue, we said one example was tendon, another example was ligament. So when you look at it under a microscope, this is low magnification. You can see that all the fiber bundles are being laid down parallel to each other. The cells which have created the fibers are in between the fiber bundles. So these fibroblasts have secreted these fibers, this bundle, then this bundle, then this bundle, and they are present in between the bundles. The location of the fibroblast nuclei is they get elongated, or they are already elongated in the direction of the fibers which they have produced, and they are therefore looking like parallel dashes, purple dashes in between the bundles that have been secreted. Dense irregular connective tissue is the dermis of the skin. So the epidermis looks like is all epithelial in nature. The dense irregular collagenous connective tissue is the dermis. So if this was highly magnified, you'd see pink streaky material, purple nuclei, mostly dash shaped in between, and lots of other things in between. Lots of blood vessels, tips of nerve endings, lymphatic channels, all stuff, the bottoms of the glands from the skin, which will the actual gland is here, and only the duct will go out and empty its sweat or its sebum or whatever onto the surface. So the gland bits, cut sections, will be all in the dermis and also in the hypodermis. So the dense irregular collagenous connective tissue of the dermis of the skin is an example. Another place where you get Irregular elastic connective tissue is, like we said, in the walls of the arteries, where elastic fibers, you can see again this has been stained particularly for elastin. Even in the previous picture we saw elastin was staining black. So here there is no pink and purple. They didn't put hematoxylin and eosin at all. They only stained for elastin. So anything which is not elastin won't even take up the stain, become invisible to you. And this shows that this part of the arterial wall is extending from here to, it's quite thick, it's getting thicker and thicker. But this portion of the arterial wall is very, very rich in elastin and irregularly laid out but densely packed. Special properties, we already said. One of the specializations of connective tissue is fat. The purpose of it is to store energy, fatty material, which is a high energy releasing material. This fatty material, to the naked eye, can look white or brown, which is why it's called white fat or yellow fat, as well as brown fat. The yellow or white fat is most abundant. The brown fat is only found in certain areas. There is a histological difference between them, and this distribution is particularly provided as a tissue packing, as a insulation, and as a padding, as a support near your organs such as the kidneys. One more specialization is reticular tissue. You can't even call it specialization. One subtype is where the protein which is making it up is reticulin. There was collagen, which is in bundles. There was elastin, which is in straight, thinner but branching fibers. And there is reticulin, which is much, much finer, thinner fibers, which tend to form lattice, lace, network like. In that network, cells can just sit. And that is the framework for lymphatic tissue, networks of fibers and cells. Adipose tissue looks like this. If you take a little bit of the tissue from the mammary gland, the milk secreting is gland, right? It is this is the skin of the breast and the duct system, which has gone in, invaginated, and become a multiple compound tubular alveolar branching structure. Remember, mammary gland we said is only compound tubular. It wasn't tubulo-alveolar, it was only tubular. And this mammary gland structure is for the secretion of milk, which is the function of the gland. But around and in between, there's a lot of extra supporting connective tissue, not epithelial, but connective tissue, which is building up the bulk, supporting all these glandular materials, is a repository for high energy adipose thing, and is giving shape and structure to that organ. So this adipose tissue, you take out a piece and stain it, you'll see that it again looks like a lot of empty spaces. It's not. Each of these is a very large cell, which is entire cytoplasm is filled up with fat. So filled up that there's no place for anything else, and its nucleus is pushed right to the corner. You get a peripheral small nucleus somewhere in each of these cells. There's no place, so the nucleus is very peripheral, dash-shaped nucleus pushed to the periphery, right? The nucleus of a cell. So the entire space of the cell is occupied by the fatty material inside the cytoplasm, which is a storage product. Reticular tissue, again with a special stain, you can actually make out these fine line-like things, which is fibers, reticular fibers. It won't stain with typical hematoxylin eosin staining, and this is the basis of almost every organ that you have. Here they are particularly mentioning the lymphoid, the lymphoid rich organs that we have, the tonsils, which are surrounding your mouth and nose, the thymus in the chest, the spleen in the abdomen, lymph nodes at all the junctions, at your axilla, at your inguinal regions, the spleen as an organ of immunity by itself, the lymphoid aggregates or collections in the linings of your digestive tract, such as at the appendix and intestinal wall, in the bone marrow of your bones, holding together your